Traveling companions. Poor Johannes was very sad, for his father was ill and would not recover. The two of them lived alone in their small house, with no one else around. The lamp on the table was burning low, and it was deep into the night. "Johannes, you are a good boy," his father said from his sickbed. "God will watch over you in this world." He looked at Johannes solemnly and affectionately, took a deep breath, and then passed away as if falling into a peaceful sleep. Johannes burst into tears. Now he was alone in the world with no father or mother, no brothers or sisters. Poor Johannes. He knelt by the bed, kissing his father's hand and shedding many bitter tears. Eventually, he closed his eyes and fell asleep on the hard bedboard. That night, he had a strange dream. He saw the sun and the moon bowing to him and saw his father alive and well again, laughing joyously as he used to. A lovely girl with long, beautiful hair wearing a golden crown reached out to Johannes. His father said, "See, you now have a beautiful bride, the most beautiful girl in the world." And then Johannes woke up, and all those beautiful things vanished. His father lay cold and stiff on the bed, with no one else to keep them company. The father was buried the following week. Johannes followed the coffin to the gravesite, never to see his dearly loved, kind father again. He heard the soil covering the coffin and saw the last corner of it disappear. One more shovel of dirt and even that corner was gone. Johannes felt an immense sorrow. His heart seemed to split in pieces. People around him sang hymns so beautifully that Johannes's tears flowed again. He cried out loud. The sun shone through the trees as if saying, "Johannes, you will no longer feel sorrow. The sky is so beautiful and blue, do you see? Your father is up there, asking the merciful God to make you forever happy." "I will always be a good person," Johannes said, "so that I, too, can go to heaven and see my father. How happy we will be to meet again. I have so much to tell him. He will show me many things and tell me about the many beautiful things in heaven, just as he did when he was with us. What joy that will be!" Johannes imagined these scenes as if he had seen them with his own eyes, and he couldn't help but smile through his tears. The birds perched high in the chestnut trees, singing, "Tweet, tweet." They, too, had attended the funeral but were still joyful. They knew well that his father had gone to heaven and had grown wings broader and more beautiful than theirs. He was now happy because he had been a good man on earth. They were all glad for him. Johannes watched them fly from the forest into the vast world, wishing he could fly with them. But first, he made a wooden cross on his father's grave. When he brought the cross to the grave in the evening, it was already decorated with sand and flowers, done by strangers who had loved his dear father. The next morning, Johannes packed his small belongings, placing the entirety of his inheritance, $50 and a few silver coins, into his belt. With this small fortune, he set off into the wide world. He first visited his father's grave in the churchyard, saying, "Goodbye, dear father. I will always be a good person. You can confidently pray to the kind God to keep me safe." Johannes walked across the fields. The flowers were brightly blooming in the warm sunlight, nodding in the wind as if to say, "Welcome to the green meadows. Do you like it here?" Johannes turned for one last look at the old church where he was baptized as a child, where he and his father attended services and sang hymns every Sunday. Then, he saw the church's little goblin standing high in a window of the church tower. Wearing his pointed little red cap, he shielded his face with his hand to block out the sun. Johannes nodded to him in farewell. The goblin also waved his red cap, placed his hand on his heart, and sent Johannes several air kisses with his fingers, wishing him well and hoping he would have a pleasant journey. Johannes thought about all the good things he would see in this vast and beautiful world. He walked further than he ever had before, through cities and past people he did not know. Now, he was among distant strangers. His first night was spent under a haystack in the fields. He thought it was interesting. No king could have a better resting place. There was a vast field, a stream, haystacks, and the wide blue sky, truly, a beautiful bedroom. The green grass with little red and white flowers served as the carpet, bushes and wild rose hedges as bouquets, and the fresh stream as his wash basin. The rushes in the stream bowed to him, bidding him good night and good morning. High in the blue sky, the moon was a huge night lamp that could never burn the curtains. Johannes could sleep peacefully, and he did until the sun came up and all the little birds sang to him, "Good morning. Good morning. Are you still not up?" The bells rang for Sunday service. Everyone was going to listen to the pastor's sermon, and Johannes joined them. He sang a hymn and listened to God's teachings. It felt like he was back in the old church where he was baptized, singing hymns with his father. The churchyard had many graves, several overgrown with tall grass. Johannes thought of his father's grave. It must be overgrown like these since he couldn't tend to it. So, he sat down, cleared away the weeds, righted the fallen crosses, and moved the wind-blown reeds back onto the graves. At the same time, he thought, now that I'm not at home, maybe someone will do the same for my father's grave. Outside the churchyard gate stood an old beggar leaning on a crutch. Johannes gave him all his few silver coins, then continued into the vast world with a light and joyful heart. That evening, the weather suddenly turned terrible. Johannes hurried to find a place to take shelter, but darkness quickly fell. At last, he saw a solitary little chapel on a hill. Fortunately, the door was not locked. He quietly entered, planning to stay there until the storm passed. "I'll just sit in this corner," he said. "I'm so tired, I need to rest." So, he sat down. Thunder roared, lightning flashed outside, and he fell asleep unknowingly, drifting into dreams. When he awoke, it was midnight, but the storm had passed, and the moonlight shone through the windows. In the center of the church lay an open coffin with an unburied dead person inside. Johannes wasn't afraid because his conscience was clear. He knew well that dead people do not harm anyone, only the living who are wicked. Now, such two wicked men were standing by the dead man. The dead man was in the church waiting to be buried. They wanted to harm him, not letting him rest in the coffin, but to throw him outside the church door. "Why would you do such a thing?" Johannes asked. "It's wrong, wicked. For God's sake, let him rest." "Nonsense," the two evil men said. "He cheated us. He owed us money, never paid back. Now he suddenly died, and we can't get a penny back. We must have our revenge. We'll make him lie like a dog outside the church door." "I have less than $50, Johannes said. "It's all the inheritance I have, but I'm willing to give it to you if you promise to let this poor man rest peacefully here. I can live without money. I'm young, have strong hands and feet, and God will help me." "All right," said the two vile men, "as long as you can pay off his debt, we'll let him be." So, they took Johannes's money, laughed heartily, thinking him too naive, and then walked away. Johannes arranged the deceased properly in the coffin, placing his hands together. He did a final goodbye, and contentedly ventured into a vast forest. The moonlight streamed through the branches, and Johannes saw many charming little elves playing merrily. They were not afraid of him, for they knew he was a kind soul. Only the wicked dislike little elves. Some were no thicker than a finger, their long golden hair tied up with golden combs. They rode on leaves and dewdrops atop blades of grass, swinging back and forth. Sometimes, a dewdrop would roll off, tumbling them into the gaps among the tall grass, eliciting laughter and shouts from the other elves. It was delightful. They sang songs Johannes recognized from his childhood. Multicolored spiders, wearing tiny crowns, were weaving long suspension bridges and palaces between the bushes. When tiny dewdrops fell on them, they shone like glass under the moonlight. When the sun rose, the elves would hide in the buds, and the wind would carry away their bridges and palaces, turning them into vast spiderwebs floating in the air. Johannes then emerged from the forest. Someone called out to him from behind, "Hey, friend. Where are you heading?" "To the wide world," Johannes replied. "I have no father, no mother. I'm a poor boy, but God will help me. I'm off to the wide world too," the stranger said. "Shall we go together?" Yes, Johannes agreed, and so they journeyed on together. Soon, they became great friends, for both were good people. However, Johannes noticed that the stranger was much wiser than himself, having traveled almost the entire world and knowing nearly everything. The sun was high when they sat under a large tree for breakfast. Just then, an older woman approached. She was very old, walked with a crutch, and had a severely bent back. She carried a bundle of sticks she had gathered in the forest, and her apron was filled with dog's mercury and willow branches. When she approached them, she slipped and fell with a cry, breaking her leg, a poor old woman. Johannes immediately suggested they carry the old woman back to her home. But the stranger took out a small bottle from his backpack, claiming he had an ointment that could immediately heal her leg and give her the strength to walk home as if it had never been broken. In exchange, he asked for the 3 branches she was carrying in her apron. "That's quite the payment you're receiving," the old woman said, nodding mysteriously. She was reluctant to give up the branches but felt uncomfortable with a broken leg. So, she handed them over. As soon as he applied the ointment to her leg, the older woman stood up and walked more vigorously than before. The ointment was indeed miraculous, but it was not available in pharmacies. "What will you do with these branches?" Johannes asked his companion. "They're 3 lovely brooms," he replied. "I like such things because I am a peculiar man." They walked a great distance. "Look, the sky's getting cloudy," Johannes pointed out, noticing a large mass of terrifying clouds ahead. "You're mistaken," the companion corrected him. "Those aren't clouds, those are mountains, majestic ones. Once you climb up there, you enter the clouds and the fresh air. It's a wonderful sight. Tomorrow, we'll venture into these mountains." Those mountains weren't as close as they appeared. It took them an entire day to reach them. The dark forests on the mountains were so tall they covered the sky. Some rocks were almost as big as whole cities. Climbing those mountains was indeed a challenging journey. Therefore, Johannes and his companion decided to rest in an inn for the night, planning to recharge for the next day's travel. Many people were in the inn's living room because someone was putting on a puppet show. He had just set up a small stage, and everyone sat around it, ready to watch. Sitting in the front row was a chubby old butcher with the best seat. He had a large, fierce dog that sat by his side, eyes wide open like all the spectators. The puppet show commenced, featuring a king and queen seated on ornate thrones, each adorned with a golden crown and their clothes trailing with long satin ribbons. Beautiful puppets with glass eyes and beards stood by the doorway, managing the entrance and exit to allow fresh air into the room. It was a captivating performance, devoid of any sorrow. However, just as the queen began to cross the stage, the portly butcher failed to hold back his dog, which suddenly leaped onto the stage and seized the queen's slender waist in its jaws. The puppeteer was horrified. He was especially fond of this queen puppet, and now this dreadful dog had bitten off her head. After the audience dispersed, the stranger who accompanied Johannes offered to repair the puppet. He produced a small bottle, applying the healing salve to the puppet, the same salve that had mended the older woman's broken leg. Instantly, the puppet was restored, capable of moving its arms and legs without strings. The puppet seemed almost human now, albeit mute. The puppeteer was overjoyed, as he no longer needed to control the puppet. This puppet could now dance on her own, something no other puppet could do. Deep into the night, when all the inn's guests had retired to their beds, someone let out a terrible sigh. The sighs persisted, prompting everyone at the inn to wake and seek out the source. The puppeteer rushed to his small theater, for the sighs seemed to originate from there. All the puppets, including the king and his attendants, were in disarray, emitting pitiful sighs in their distress. Their glassy eyes looked vacant, longing for a dab of the magical salve that could animate them just like the queen. The queen immediately knelt, raising her beautiful crown as a plea, "Take this. Please apply some salve to my husband and his ministers." The poor theater owner and creator of the puppets couldn't help but cry, deeply moved by their plight. He quickly promised the stranger accompanying Johannes all the earnings from the next night's performance if he would only apply the salve to 4 or 5 of his most beautiful puppets. However, the stranger claimed he needed nothing but the sword the theater owner wore at his side. After receiving the sword, he applied the salve to 6 puppets. Instantly, the 6 puppets began to dance charmingly, joined by the human ladies present. The coachman danced with the cooks and the male servants with the female servants. All guests, even all the fire shovels and tongs, joined the dance, although the latter two stumbled at first. Indeed, it was a night filled with joy. The next morning, Johannes and his companion left everyone behind, climbing the high mountains and passing through vast pine forests. They ascended so high that the church spires below appeared no more than small red berries amidst the green trees. They beheld vast landscapes never seen before, sights Johannes had never imagined in this lovely world. Warmed by the sun amidst the fresh, azure sky, they heard hunters joyously blowing their horns in the mountains. Overwhelmed with happiness, Johannes exclaimed, "Merciful God, I want to kiss you, for you are so good to us, showing us the most beautiful wonders of the world." His companion also paused, clasping his hands together, gazing at the forests and cities bathed in warm sunlight. Just then, a beautiful voice resounded above them. Looking up, they saw a magnificent white swan soaring through the air. The swan was lovely, singing a song unlike any they had heard before. But the song slowly faded away. The swan bowed its head, slowly descending to their feet, where the beautiful creature lay dead. "The wings of this white swan are magnificent," remarked the companion, "so white and broad, truly valuable. I shall take them with me. You see how useful a sword can be, don't you?" With that, he quickly severed the dead swan's wings, intending to take them along. The two journeyed much further through the mountains, eventually approaching a large city. The city boasted over 100 spires, reflecting the sunlight like silver. In the city's center stood a beautiful marble palace with a gold roof, which was the residence of the king. Johannes and his traveling companion chose not to enter the city immediately. Instead, they stopped at an inn just outside the city to change their attire, wanting to look presentable when they walked the streets. The innkeeper informed them that the king was a virtuous monarch who never harmed anyone. However, his daughter, the princess, was quite the opposite, wicked to the core. Despite her unparalleled beauty and allure, it was of no benefit, for she was a malicious witch responsible for the deaths of many charming princes. Anyone could propose to her, as she had allowed. It didn't matter if the suitor was a prince or a pauper, her eyes had no distinction. The suitor only needed to guess the answers to 3 questions she posed. Success meant marriage to the princess and eventually ascending to the throne as king upon her father's death. Failure, however, resulted in execution by hanging. Such was the cruelty and malice of this beautiful princess. The old king, her father, was deeply saddened by her malevolence but found himself powerless to change her ways due to a promise he once made never to interfere in her choice of suitors. Each time a prince attempted to guess the answers and win the princess's hand, he would inevitably fail and be sentenced to death. These suitors were not without warning. They were advised to abandon their pursuit. The king was greatly distressed by these tragic occurrences, so much so that he and his entire army would spend a whole day kneeling and praying in hopes of the princess turning a new leaf. Yet, she remained unyielding. In his sorrow, the king would even dye his brandy black before drinking it, as they were bereft of any other means to express their mourning. "Hideous princess," exclaimed Johannes. "She should be soundly whipped, that would do her good. If I were the old king, I'd whip her until she bled." At that moment, those outside heard his words and shouted in agreement. The princess was passing by. Indeed, she was exceedingly beautiful, causing the people to momentarily forget her wickedness as they, too, shouted, "Hooray!" 12 beautiful young maidens, dressed in white silk dresses, each holding a golden tulip, rode alongside her on 12 jet-black steeds. The princess herself was mounted on a white horse adorned with diamonds and rubies. Her riding attire was pure gold, and the whip in her hand shone like the sun's rays. The golden crown on her head looked as if it were made of stars plucked from the sky, and her outer garment was sewn from the wings of over 1,000 beautiful butterflies. Yet, she was far more attractive than her clothes. Upon seeing her, Johannes's face turned as red as blood, and he was rendered speechless. The princess resembled the beautiful woman with a golden crown he had dreamt of on the night his father died. He found her so captivating that he couldn't help but fall in love. He expressed disbelief that she was a malicious witch who sent men to the gallows for failing to answer her riddles. Since she allows everyone to propose, even the poorest beggar, I too must go to the palace, for I have no other choice, he declared. Everyone tried to dissuade him from attempting such a feat, warning him that he would meet the same fate as others. His companion also advised against it, but Johannes was optimistic. He brushed his shoes and clothes, washed his face and hands, and combed his beautiful yellow hair. Then, he entered the city alone, heading straight for the royal palace. "Come in," said the old king when Johannes knocked on the door. Johannes pushed the door open. The old king, wearing a long robe and embroidered slippers, greeted him. He had a crown on his head and held a scepter in one hand and a golden orb in the other. "Just a moment," he said, tucking the orb under his arm to shake Johannes's hand. However, upon learning that his visitor was a suitor, he began to sob uncontrollably, dropping his scepter and orb to the floor and using his robe to wipe his tears. Poor old king. "Please, don't propose," he implored. "You'll be executed like all the others. Just look, and you'll see." He then took Johannes to the princess's pleasure garden. The sight was horrifying. Each tree hung with 3 or 4 princes' corpses. All had proposed to the princess but failed to guess her riddles. A slight breeze made the bones rattle, scaring away the birds, who dared not fly into the garden again. Flowers twined around human bones, and skulls lay in flower pots, grinning eerily. "Take a good look around," the old king said. "The fate of these men will be yours too. You'd best abandon your intent. It pains me greatly to say this, but I cannot help." Johannes kissed the kind old king's hand, assuring him that all would be well, for he dearly loved the beautiful princess. As they spoke, the princess rode into the palace courtyard with all her ladies-in-waiting. They all went to greet her, and she was indeed very beautiful. She shook hands with Johannes, who now loved her even more, convinced she could not be the wicked which everyone described. They entered the great hall together, where pages brought them candied fruits and spiced walnut kernels to welcome them. However, the old king was so distressed he could not eat a thing. They agreed that Johannes would return to the palace the next morning when judges and all the privy councillors would be present to hear how he answered the questions. If he succeeded, he would need to return for 2 more days. Yet, so far, no one had passed even the first trial, thus losing their lives. Johannes was not saddened by his fate but felt quite cheerful. His thoughts were filled only with the beautiful princess, and he was sure that kind Providence would aid him, though he had no idea how and preferred not to dwell on it. He bounced and skipped on his way back to the inn, where his companion awaited him. Johannes could not stop talking about how kindly the princess had treated him and how beautiful she was. He eagerly awaited the next day when he would try his luck at guessing. However, his companion shook his head, looking very sorrowful. "I like you so much," he said. "We could have had more time together, but now I'm about to lose you." Poor, dear Johannes. I wish I could weep, but I don't want to spoil your joy on what might be our last night together. Let's be merry tonight. I'll weep all I want tomorrow after you've gone. Word quickly spread among the townsfolk that the princess had a new suitor, which was a very sad affair for them. The theaters closed, the older women selling pastries tied black ribbons around their sugar pigs, and the king and the clergy knelt in the churches praying. Everywhere was imbued with sorrow, as everyone felt Johannes's fate would likely be no better than the other suitors. In the evening, the companion mixed a large bowl of punch, telling Johannes, "Now let's be merry and drink to the princess's health." However, after just 2 glasses, Johannes felt so sleepy he could no longer keep his eyes open and soon fell into a deep sleep. The companion gently lifted him from the chair and laid him on the bed. Late at night, he took out the 2 large wings he had cut from the swan, attached them to his shoulders, and placed the longest of the 3 branches he had got from the older woman who had broken her leg into his pocket. Then, he opened the window and flew into the city, all the way to the royal palace, where he sat down in a corner below the princess's bedroom window. The city was silent when the clock struck 11:45. The window opened, and the princess, dressed in a long white garment and spreading her black wings, flew over the city towards a large mountain. The companion had made himself invisible, so she could not see him as he followed behind her. He struck her with the branch so that wherever it touched her, she bled. The wind spread her cloak like a large sail around her. "Hailstones really sting," the princess exclaimed with each lash from the branch, serving as a lesson for her. Eventually, she reached the mountain and knocked on it. The mountain seemed to thunder in response and split open, allowing the princess to enter, with the companion following unseen. They walked through a long, wide passage, where the walls emitted an eerie glow, thanks to thousands of illuminating spiders crawling up and down, casting a fiery radiance. They entered a hall built with gold and silver, with walls adorned with red and blue flowers as large as sunflowers, shining brightly. However, these flowers were unreachable. Their stems were poisonous snakes, and the blooms were their flaming breath. The ceiling was alive with glowing fireflies and fluttering sky-blue bats, an intimidating sight. In the center, there stood a throne, supported by the skeletons of 4 horses, with blood-red spider silk as their bridles. The throne was made of milk-white glass, with a cushion of black mice biting each other's tails and a canopy of pink spider webs adorned with beautiful, gem-like green flies. Crowned and holding a scepter, an old sorcerer sat upon the throne. He kissed the princess on the forehead and invited her to sit beside him on a throne. The music then began to play, giant black grasshoppers on violins and owls drumming their bellies, making a wonderful orchestra. Many small black goblins with hats glowing with ghostly fires danced in the hall. But the companion, invisible behind the throne, saw everything and heard everything. The courtiers arrived, looking proud and imperious, yet to the discerning eye, they were nothing more than brooms with old cabbage roots for heads, animated and dressed by the sorcerer's magic. After dancing for a while, the princess informed the sorcerer about having a new suitor. She wondered what question she should ask him when he came to the palace the next day. "Listen," said the sorcerer, "you should choose something very simple, as that will be least expected." "What about your shoes?" "That's something he will never guess. Have his head cut off, but remember to bring his eyes to me tomorrow night. I want to try how they taste." The princess curtsied and promised she wouldn't forget the eyes. The sorcerer then opened the mountain, and she flew back home. The companion followed her, furiously whipping her with the switch, making her exclaim in pain. She mistook the lashes for hailstones. She flew fast, hoping to reach her window and return to her bedroom quickly. When the companion returned to the inn, Johannes was still fast asleep. He removed the wings and also went to bed, exhausted from the night's adventure. When Johannes awoke, it was morning, and his companion had also risen. He had told him about a strange dream involving the princess and her shoe. This was exactly what he had heard from the sorcerer in the mountain, but he didn't reveal the truth to Johannes. Instead, he suggested Johannes ask the princess if she had been thinking about her shoe. "I could certainly ask her that and anything else," Johannes said. Maybe your dream was meaningful because I have always believed that God will help me. But now I must say goodbye, for if I guess wrong, I will never see you again." They hugged each other goodbye, and Johannes went into the city, straight to the palace. The hall was crowded. The judges sat in armchairs with many soft cushions behind their heads, ready to think hard. When the princess entered, the old king got up and wiped his eyes with a white handkerchief. She was even more beautiful than the day before and greeted everyone graciously. She shook hands with Johannes, who was now even more in love with her, unable to believe she could be the wicked which everyone claimed. Together, they went to the great hall where Johannes was to guess what she was thinking. She looked at him sweetly, but when he mentioned a shoe, her face turned pale. She trembled, for he had guessed correctly. The old king was so happy that he somersaulted, an amusing sight for everyone. The people clapped for Johannes, the first to have guessed right. The companion was pleased with the successful outcome, but Johannes thanked the kind God, hopeful for his help in the next trial. The next evening was similar to the previous one. Johannes slept soundly while the companion followed the princess to the mountain again, this time hitting her even harder with the 2 switches. Invisible, he heard the princess's next thought was about a glove. The companion shared this with Johannes as a dream, leading Johannes to guess correctly once again. The palace rejoiced at Johannes's success. Ministers and judges somersaulted as they had seen the king do. The princess alone lay on the sofa, speechless. Now, the question was whether Johannes would guess correctly a 3rd time. If he did, not only would he win the beautiful princess, but he would also inherit the entire kingdom after the king's death. He would lose his life if he guessed wrong, and the sorcerer would eat his beautiful blue eyes. Johannes went to bed early that evening. After saying his evening prayers, he fell asleep peacefully. However, the companion once again strapped the wings to his back, hung the sword at his side, and took the 3 switches before flying off towards the palace. It was a pitch-dark night. The wind was so strong it blew the tiles off the roofs. The trees in the garden, where skeletons hung, fell over in the storm like reeds. Lightning flashed every second, and the thunder rolled as if it were the only sound all night. Then, the princess flew out of her window, her face as pale as death, yet she laughed at the storm as if it weren't fierce enough. Her white gown billowed out behind her like a huge sail. But this time, the companion whipped her with the 3 switches, her blood dripping to the ground, leaving her barely enough strength to keep flying. Eventually, she managed to reach the mountain. "The hail and the violent wind are fierce," she said. "I have never flown out in such weather." "No pain, no gain," said the sorcerer. She told him again that Johannes was guessing correctly. If he guessed right the next day, he would win, and she would no longer be able to fly to the mountain to see him, nor could she practice magic as before, which made her very sad. "He will not guess it this time," said the sorcerer. "I will think of something he could not possibly dream of. If he still guesses right, he is a greater sorcerer than I. But for now, let's be merry." So, he took the princess by the hand, and they danced with all the goblins and will-o'-the-wisps in the house. The red spiders danced up and down the walls like many fire-red flowers emitting sparks. The owls drummed, the crickets played their flutes, and the black grasshoppers strummed their guitars. It was a merry dance. After dancing for quite a while, the princess had to return home, or they would miss her at the palace. The sorcerer said he would accompany her back, which meant he could spend more time with her. They flew through the dreadful weather. The companion broke all 3 of his switches over their backs. The sorcerer had never traveled in such severe hail before. He bid farewell to the princess in front of the palace, whispering in her ear to think of his head. The companion heard this. At that moment, the princess flew back into her room through her window. Just as the sorcerer turned to leave, the companion grabbed his long, black beard and cut off his ugly head with a sword so fast that the sorcerer didn't even have time to look back. He threw the body into the sea to feed the fish. As for the head, he merely dipped it in water, wrapped it in a damp cloth, took it back to the inn, and then laid down to sleep. The next morning, he handed the cloth package to Johannes, but told him not to open it until the princess asked him what she was thinking. The palace hall was now crowded with people. They packed together tightly like a bunch of radishes. The judges sat in armchairs with many soft cushions behind their heads. The old king also put on new clothes. His golden crown and scepter were polished, looking very splendid. But the princess was pale, dressed in deep black as if she were going to a funeral. "What am I thinking of now?" she asked. Johannes immediately opened his cloth package. When he saw the sorcerer's ugly head, he was as shocked as everyone else, for it was horrifying. But the princess sat like a statue, unable to speak. Eventually, she stood up and reached out her hand to Johannes because he had guessed correctly. She didn't look at anyone, only sighed deeply. "You are now my husband. We shall marry tonight," she said. "How pleased I am," said the old king. "This fulfills my wish." Everyone present erupted into cheers. Bands played in the streets, church bells rang, and the old cake sellers removed the black veils from their sugar pigs, as everyone was very happy now. 3 roasted oxen, stuffed with ducks and chickens, were placed in the market square for anyone to cut a piece for themselves. Fountains flowed with wine. People could go to the bakery, spend a silver coin for a loaf of bread, and receive 6 sweet buns as a gift, each stuffed with raisins. The entire city was as bright as day throughout the night. Soldiers fired salutes, and children set off firecrackers. The palace had a feast with drinking, toasting, and dancing. Gentlemen and ladies danced in pairs. Those living far away could hear their singing. Yet, the princess remained a witch at heart and was not too fond of Johannes. The companion had anticipated this, so he had given Johannes 3 feathers from a swan's wings and a small bottle filled with a few drops of water. He instructed Johannes to place a tub full of water in front of the princess's bed and, when she was about to get into bed, to push her gently so she would fall into the water. He was to pour the feathers and the water from the bottle into the tub and then dip her into the water 3 times. This would rid her of the witchcraft and transform her into a kind princess. Johannes did as the companion had instructed. When he dipped the princess into the water, she screamed and turned into a black swan with bright eyes, struggling under his hands. The second time she emerged from the water, she turned white, except for a black ring around her neck. Johannes prayed to God and dipped the swan into the water for the 3rd time. Immediately, she transformed back into a lovely princess, more beautiful than before, with tears in her eyes. She thanked Johannes for driving away the witchcraft that had been upon her. The next day, the old king arrived with all his courtiers for the grand celebration, which lasted the entire day. The companion was the last guest to arrive, leaning on his staff and carrying his knapsack on his back. Johannes kissed him several times, begging him not to leave and asking him to stay and live with them, for Johannes owed all his happiness to him. But the companion shook his head, smiling kindly and benevolently, saying, "No, my time is up. I was merely repaying my debt. Do you remember the dead body that the 2 villains wanted to harm? You gave all you had so the dead could rest peacefully. I am that dead man." After saying this, he vanished. The wedding celebration continued for an entire month. Johannes and the princess sincerely loved each other. The old king lived out his days happily, with the princess's children playing on his knees and toying with his wand. Eventually, Johannes became the ruler of the entire kingdom. On this peaceful night, may all beautiful dreams surround you, cradling you into a night of good sleep. Good night.